podcast Green Edge, Best in BESS. Episode 5, How to Develop a BESS Project in Poland. Hello and welcome back to Green Edge, Best in BESS, the podcast for international investors and developers looking seriously at the Polish battery storage market. I'm Jerzy Kuźmiński, and if this is your first time here, episodes 1 through 4 are already out and cover everything from what BESS actually is and why Poland matters, through what's inside the container, C&I economics, and in the last episode, a deep dive into the new UC84 grid connection law that changed the rules of the game for everyone with projects in the pipeline. If you haven't heard that one yet, I'd actually suggest going back and listening to it before this one, because today we're going to build on some of those concepts. Today's episode is about the development process itself, the full journey from finding a piece of land to standing at the construction site with a valid building permit, a signed grid connection agreement, and a project that is genuinely ready to build. Now, the distance between an idea and RTB project is where most projects succeed or fail. I want to be direct at the very beginning. This process is not short and it's not cheap. We're talking about 18 to 24 months in a realistic scenario and development costs that typically represent 2 to 5% of total CAPEX. For a 50 megawatt project with CAPEX in the range of 25 million euros, that means €500,000 to over €1 million spent before a single container arrives on site. So when someone shows you a deck with a project in early development and says it'll be RTB in 6 months, you now know what questions to ask. So let's get through it stage by stage. Everything starts with the location. And in the Polish BESS market, there are two schools of thought on how to approach this. The first approach starts with the grid. You identify a substation, a GPZ in Polish, which is the main supply point, that has available connection capacity and reasonable upgrade prospects, and you work outward from there to find land within a sensible cable distance. The logic is straightforward. The grid connection is often the hardest constraint to resolve, so you optimize for that first. The second approach starts with the land. You find a plot that is already covered by a local zoning plan, permitting energy infrastructure, or better yet, already fits energy storage under existing zoning interpretation. And then you look for a substation that can accommodate the project within a reasonable distance. The logic here is that permitting is often the second hardest constraint, and a clean permitting situation is worth paying for in extra cable length. In practice, experienced developers in Poland usually do both simultaneously and look for the intersection, a location where you have a substation with capacity and land that won't fight you on permits. That intersection is increasingly rare as the market has matured, which is one reason why a proper RTB projects cost more than pre-RTB. On the land side, you're typically looking at long-term lease agreements rather than outright purchase. A BESS project needs the land for 20, maybe 25 years, including the commissioning, and landowners are generally more willing to lease than sell. Key things to get right in the lease agreement: duration and renewal options, annual rent escalation mechanism, the right to assign the lease to a future investor or buyer, access rights for subcontractors, and, this one gets overlooked constantly, the obligation to restore the land to its original condition after decommissioning. Concrete foundations, underground cables, fencing. Removal costs at the end of life can run into hundreds of thousands of euros. And if your lease agreement requires full restoration, that needs to be in your financial model from day one. Also check the land registry carefully before signing anything. Ownership needs to be unambiguous. No ongoing inheritance proceedings, no co-owners who haven't signed, no encumbrances that could complicate your project. I've seen deals fall apart months in because someone discovered a mortgage or a right-of-way on the parcel that nobody noticed earlier. Typical timeline for site selection and securing the land is around 1 to 3 months for a well-resourced team. But this step runs in parallel with the next one, so let's move on. Once you have a site candidate, the next question is whether you can actually build there. And this is where Polish planning law gets interesting. And as of 2026, it's going through a significant transition. Historically, there were two paths in Poland. If the municipality had a local zoning plan in place called MPZP that permitted energy infrastructure on your plot, you could rely on that plan and move forward. If there was no MPZP for your area, you applied for an individual planning decision called a WZ, which could determine whether and under what conditions you could build. The WZ process typically took 2 to 6 months, sometimes longer if there were appeals. BESS projects created an interesting interpretive challenges in this system because energy storage is a relatively new category of development and many zoning plans didn't explicitly mention it. The question became, is a battery storage a facility classified as technical infrastructure, as an industrial object, or something else? Well, I've seen municipalities go both ways on this. The key takeaway is that you always want a written confirmation from the relevant authority, not an oral interpretation from someone on the phone before you commit resources to a site. And trust me, to get something in writing from the Polish administration is a very rare thing. Now here's the change that matters for everyone looking at the Polish market today. The WZ system is being replaced. Poland is transitioning to what are called general plans, which are a new form of planning document that every municipality is required to adopt. The law is already in force, and municipalities have until the end of August 2026 to enact their general plans. After that deadline, they will no longer be able to issue individual zoning conditions decisions. What does this mean for BESS development? A few things. First, in the short term, like right now, there is a window where some municipalities are still issuing the zoning conditions decisions under the old system, but that window is closing fast. If you have a site where a zoning condition is the right path and the municipality is one of the few that already has a general plan adopted, you need to check whether your project category fits the new zoning designations. Second, for projects that fall into areas where a general plan is still being drafted, there's a meaningful uncertainty about how energy storage will be categorized when the plan is finalized. Some municipalities will designate clear zones for energy infrastructure, others won't, and then you're back to an interpretive question under the new framework. Third, where general plans are required and don't yet exist, getting a new development approved for a BESS may become a significantly longer and more expensive process than it is, or than it was under the zoning condition system. Potentially 2 years instead of 6 months, and with more legal complexity. My honest assessment: the transition to general plans will bring more consistency and clarity in the long run, but in the short term it creates real friction. Projects that are already through the permitting stage or clearly covered by existing MPZP provisions are worth more precisely because they've navigated this uncertainty. Projects still at the permitting stage in municipalities without adopted general plans carry meaningful timing risk. Typical timeline, if an MPZP is in place and favorable, essentially no delay. Zoning condition under the old system 2 to 6 months, sometimes longer. Under the new general plan framework, well, variable and still emerging, but plan for more rather than less. Depending on the size and location of your project, you may need an environmental impact assessment. For BESS projects, the key threshold is 1 hectare of developed area. Projects above that threshold generally require a formal environmental decision. If your site is in or near a Natura 2000 protected area, the threshold drops to 0.5 hectare. Below these thresholds, you typically don't need a full environmental decision, but you may still need to prepare a simplified environmental impact report, particularly in sensitive locations. For larger utility-scale projects, this step is almost always required and adds time to the development path. The process involves engaging an environmental consultant, preparing the report, submitting to the relevant authority, typically the regional director for environmental protection, and going through a public consultation period. In practice, well, optimistic guys says 3 to 6 months is a reasonable estimate for this step in a straightforward case, but to be honest, you should plan for 1 to 2 years. The locations near protected areas or with noise-sensitive neighbors can take significantly longer and sometimes generate appeals that add months to the timeline. One thing worth flagging, especially for BESS: noise. Battery storage systems generate noise from cooling units, fans, air handling equipment, liquid cooling pumps, and so on. The Polish limit at the boundary of a residential building is 50 decibels during the day and only 40 decibels at night. A BESS facility operates around the clock. If your site is within a few hundred meters of residential buildings, You need an acoustic study early in the development process, not as an afterthought. I've seen projects where the acoustic constraints effectively killed the location, which would have been discovered in week 2 with a proper feasibility assessment, but was only discovered much later at significant cost. This is no joke. If you plan to build your BESS in the near vicinity of the households, you might have issues with the neighbors, so keep a close eye to that. Grid connection is, in most cases, the critical path of the entire development. Everything else can run in parallel, but until you have confirmed grid connection conditions that are realistic and financeable, you don't have a project, you have a hypothesis. In Poland, you're dealing with one of 4 distribution system operators depending on your location: Enea, Energa, PGE or Tauron. For projects connecting at high voltage or directly to the transmission grid, PSE, the transmission system operator. Each operator has its own procedures, processing times and internal culture, and this matters more than people from Western European markets typically expect. The process starts with submitting an application for connection conditions. Under the rules that applied before UC84, this application came with a deposit of 30 PLN per kilowatt of requested capacity, with a maximum of 3 million PLN. Under UC84, that deposit has been doubled to 60 PLN per kilowatt, with a maximum of 6 million. For a 50 megawatt project, you're looking at 3 million PLN, roughly 700,000 euros, that you need to put up before the operator even starts evaluating your application. There is also a new application fee that UC84 introduced, 1 PLN per kilowatt up to 100,000 PLN. This is non-refundable regardless of outcome. Small in absolute terms, but it's a signal about the direction of travel. The regulatory intent is clearly to make casual applications more expensive, which is a reasonable response to the zombie project problem, but adds to the upfront capital requirement. Once the deposit is paid and the application is accepted, operators have 120 days for medium voltage connection and 180 days for high voltage connection to issue the grid connection conditions. These timelines can be extended by 50% under certain circumstances, so in the worst case you're looking at 180 days for medium voltage and 270 days for high voltage from the payment of the deposit. Not from the submission, but from the payment. So keep that distinction in mind when you're building your timeline. What comes back in the connection conditions matters enormously. The document specifies the connection point, the technical requirements your installation must meet, the split of scope between what the operator builds and what you build, and the connection fee. The connection fee and the infrastructure scope are where a lot of projects discover that the economics look very different from what the desk analysis suggested. A 10-kilometer cable route on your site or a requirement to upgrade a substation transformer can add millions to your CAPEX that weren't in the model. One important UC84 change: the validity of connection conditions has been reduced from 2 years to 1 year. You now have 12 months from the issuance of conditions to sign the connection agreement. For projects that need to close financing before signing the connection agreement, this creates real pressure. 12 months is not a lot of time if you're also navigating environmental permits, other permitting and bank due diligence simultaneously. After signing the connection agreement, you're into the milestone regime that UC84 introduced. The key milestone: you must obtain a valid building permit for at least 80% of your requested capacity within 24 months of signing the connection agreement. Miss that milestone without a valid force majeure justification, and the connection agreement expires by operation of law. No extensions, no grace period, it's gone. I want to be clear about my view on this mechanism. The 24-month deadline for a building permit is not unreasonable for a project that is genuinely being developed. Under normal circumstances, a building permit takes 3 to 6 months to obtain once you have all the proceeding steps in order. Even with complications, appeals, coordination with railway authorities, water management authorities, road administrators, 24 months from a signed connection agreement is achievable if the project is real. What UC84 also introduced, which is worth understanding, is a grace mechanism for cases where the delay is caused by the public administration itself. If you can demonstrate that you submitted applications on time and followed up diligently, but the relevant authority took longer than required to issue a decision, you can apply for a deadline extension up to 24 additional months. But you need to post additional security of 60 PLN per kilowatt for that extension. it's a safety valve for genuine projects caught in bureaucratic delays, and the Senate was right to insist on it. Two new contract types also entered the picture under UC84. The Flexible Connection Agreement allows you to connect before the grid is fully upgraded to handle your capacity, operating under temporary curtailment that expires no later than 3 years after commissioning. That's a reasonable and useful tool. The Configurable Connection Agreement is more problematic, and I covered this in detail in episode 4. The short version: configurable connections can impose variable curtailment based on real-time grid conditions, and those curtailments can be indefinite. They don't expire after 3 years. For financing purposes, a configurable connection makes it essentially impossible to finance the full installed capacity, because the bank cannot underwrite revenue from a system that the operator can curtail without limit and without compensation. If an operator offers you a configurable connection, read every word of the curtailment provisions before you accept it. With the grid connection conditions in hand, environmental decisions resolved and zoning confirmed, you can proceed to the building permit. The building permit requires a full architectural and construction design package, which is building project. This is different from the technical execution design you'll need for construction, but the PB covers what you're putting on the land, so site layout, foundations, fencing, access road, physical footprint of the installation. Electrical schematics, protection coordination, SCADA architecture, those go in a separate execution design that's prepared later, typically during the EPC phase. The building project package requires several supporting documents: a geodetic map prepared for design purposes, a site development plan, documented access to a public road, geological survey results, and, as I mentioned, an acoustic study if your site is near residential areas. Depending on your location, you may also need coordination with the railway authority, water management authority, or road administrators, each of which runs on its own timeline. The building permit application is submitted to the county authority, which has around 65 days to issue a decision. In practice, the first response is often a request for supplementary documentation rather than a permit, which stops the clock until you resubmit. Budget 2 to 4 months for this step in a clean case, and more if complications arise. One detail worth noting for international investors: what the Polish system calls a building permit is actually an administrative decision authorizing the construction of a specific design. If you want to change something about the project after the permit is issued, either you need to add a container, change the layout, modify the foundation designs, you need either a change to the existing permit or a new one. This means the technical design needs to be sufficiently firm before you apply, which creates an interesting tension with the equipment selection process. Most experienced developers handle this by designing to a generic equipment envelope and then refining with actual equipment specifications later, sometimes via an amendment to the permit. The cable route is one of the most underestimated elements of the development process, and in my experience, it's where a disproportionate number of projects run into trouble. The connection conditions tell you where to connect and at what voltage. What they don't tell you is how easy it will be to get there. The cable route from your site to the connection point crosses plots owned by different landowners, some of whom live locally and are reachable in a day, others who live in different cities or countries and haven't responded to letters for months. Each plot on the cable route requires a right-of-way agreement, granting you the right to lay cables and access them for maintenance. Each agreement requires a willing landowner, a notarized contract, and in most cases, registration in the land registry. 12 plots on the cable route means 12 negotiations. If even one landowner refuses or is unreachable, you have a problem that ranges from expensive to project killing, depending on the alternatives. I'll give you a real example from the Polish market. A project I reviewed had a cable route of 8 kilometers, of which 1.5 kilometers were secured. The remaining 6.5 kilometers crossed 12 separate plots, each with its own ownership situation. Two of the landowners had disputes with neighbors. One plot had an unresolved inheritance, one ran through a rail corridor requiring coordination with the state railway authority, and one section required crossing a regional road, which added another authority to the approval chain. That project was presented as RTB within 3 months. Well, come on guys, it's not. UC84 introduced a positive change here. Cable pooling has been extended to cover battery storage. Previously, the cable pooling mechanism, which allows multiple installations to share a single connection, applied only to renewable energy sources. Now, BESS can join a cable pool with an existing PV farm or a wind farm. For retrofit projects, adding storage to an existing solar installation, well, this is genuinely significant because it removes one of the main barriers, which was the cost and time of obtaining a separate connection for the BESS component. If you have projects in the pipeline, or if you're evaluating the purchase of a project that was developed under the old rules, there's one more UC84 element you need to understand: retroactivity. As I covered in depth in episode 4, UC84 applies the new financial requirements not only to new projects, but also to projects that already had connection conditions issued or connection agreements signed before the law came into force. The transitional provisions give short deadlines to comply with the new requirements, and failing to meet those deadlines can result in the expiry of connection conditions or agreements. For international investors evaluating project acquisitions, this is due diligence item number 1. Check the date of issuance of connection conditions. Check whether a connection agreement is signed. Check what the transitional period compliance requirements are and whether the seller has already addressed them. A project that looks RTB on the surface but has an unresolved retroactivity exposure is carrying a material liability that should be priced into the transaction. Now let me close the development process section with a definition, because RTB is one of the most abused terms in the Polish project market. A genuinely ready-to-build project has valid grid connection conditions with a realistic cable route and scope, or better, a signed connection agreement. A signed long-term lease agreement covering all required plots, including the cable route. A valid building permit for the full project. An environmental decision where required, and zoning confirmed either through MPZP or the appropriate planning document. It does not have open questions about any of these items. What the market frequently calls RTB is something quite different. It might be a project with connection conditions that are about to expire, or conditions where the cable route is mostly secured but negotiations are ongoing on 3 plots, let's say. Or a building permit that covers the main BESS but not the access road, or zoning that worked under zoning conditions but now needs re-evaluation under the general plan regime. These are all real situations I've seen in the Polish market in the past years. The pipeline project versus RTB project distinction matters enormously for valuation. Developing a project from early stage to genuine RTB typically costs 2 to 5% of CAPEX and takes 18 to 24 months. A project that is truly RTB should reflect that value. A project that is early stage but marketed as a near RTB often reflects the seller's optimism more than the project's actual status. GreenEdge solutions exist largely to bridge that gap. We do the technical and regulatory verification that separates real RTB from hopeful RTB, and we've seen enough projects in the Polish market to know where the bodies are buried. There's a topic I want to address directly because I see it play out repeatedly with international developers trying to develop Polish BESS projects remotely. The logic seems sound. You have an experienced team in London or Amsterdam or Munich. The procedures are broadly similar across Europe. Grid connection application, environmental assessment, building permit. You can do the analysis in Excel. You can run calls with Polish advisors. You can hire a local lawyer. What could go wrong? Well, a lot. One conversation with the right person at the county office can resolve in 20 minutes what 3 months of email correspondence couldn't. A phone call to the distribution operator's technical department, not their official submission portal, but the person who actually reviews applications, can tell you things about the realistic queue and processing time that you will never find in any public document. Understanding how a specific municipality interprets energy storage under their zoning plan often comes from knowing someone who has built a project there before. This isn't about corruption or informal networks in any problematic sense. It's simply about the fact that Poland's administrative system rewards local presence, established relationship, and Polish language fluency in a way that remote management cannot replicate. The developers who succeed consistently in the Polish BESS market have people on the ground, full stop. If you're a foreign investor looking at the Polish market, the options are hire a Polish development team, partner with a local developer, or engage a local advisory firm from the start. What doesn't work is running the process from abroad with periodic site visits and expecting Western European efficiency and predictability. None of this makes Poland a bad market, quite the opposite. The markets that are easy to develop are usually the ones where you can't make money anymore. The fact that Polish BESS development requires experience, local presence and careful navigation is exactly why first movers with the right capabilities will generate returns that wouldn't be available in more mature markets. Now, before I let you go, two things. If today's episode was useful, the best thing you can do is to share it with someone who's looking at the Polish market. A developer, an investor, a fund analyst who keeps asking you about Poland. This podcast exists to give people an honest picture of what they're getting into. And the more people who hear it, the better the conversation I get to have. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do it now. New episodes come out every week, and the topics coming up over the next few months are ones you don't want to miss. Now, on the practical side, if something in today's episode connects directly to a situation you're in, here's where we can help. If you're at the development or acquisition stage, evaluating a site, trying to understand whether a project is genuinely RTB or just marked that way, navigating the UC84 retroactivity provisions, running an RFP for an EPC contractor, or simply trying to figure out whether the Polish market makes sense for your strategy, that's Green Edge Solutions. We do project analysis, due diligence, market entry guidance, and advisory from greenfield all the way through to RTB. If the project doesn't make sense, we'll tell you. Contact us via email or find us at greenedgesolutions.com. If you already have a project under construction or operating and you need someone on the ground who's actually watching what's happening, not just reading reports, that's ROA Systems. We handle O&M, 24/7 active monitoring, technical hotline, investors supervising during construction, and owners engineering across Central and Western Europe. We're the people who show up on site, not the people who send you a monthly PDF. You'll find direct contact in the episode description. Now, thanks for listening and see you next week. Cześć!